everyone. Welcome to the Columbus Metropolitan Club. I'm Carol Newcomb-Aludo, the chair of CMC's board. It's great to see everyone here. It's also great to look out there and see that marvelous fog that sort of makes the city look more interesting in a different way. Although sun would be great too, right? Today's forum, Ohio's Budget, Follow the Money, is presented in partnership with the Center for Community Solutions and the Buckeye Institute, each represented here by many friends. Won't you please help me thank them? Ohio's budget is developed biannually, and while the occasion of a new governor presents the opportunity to establish new priorities in the budget, it's still left to the House and the Senate to accept or modify or strike these initiatives, as Governor Kasich learned repeatedly. As with any budget, there are many constituencies with skin in the game, but ultimately it's us, the people, who pay for and live with the budget. We know the needs from education to healthcare to transportation to safety are big and complex, and likewise is the budget. Let's explore these issues. Please welcome our experts, Research Fellow at the Buckeye Institute, Greg Lawson, Executive Director of the Children's Defense Fund Ohio, Tracy Nájera, author of Follow the Money, Terry Thomas, and our host, Bureau Chief of the Ohio Statehouse News Bureau, Karen Kasler. Terry Thomas is going to provide us with opening remarks to set the stage, and then Karen will lead the conversation. Terry, the podium is yours.
Thank you, Carol, and greetings everyone this afternoon. What a wonderful backdrop we have there with the fog. It's kind of mysterious today, but it is always a good day in Columbus, Ohio. The phrase "follow the money," which is the title for our program and also the title of our book, copies conveniently there for your purchase, I see on the front table. The phrase "follow the money" was first popularized, for those who may not know, and I trust probably in this group, probably everyone knows, in the 1970s film All the President's Men. That reference to follow the money referred to, of course, government corruption at the highest level. Now, I think when Dick Sheridan, the original author of the book, came up with this title, it was not in reference to that kind of sinister approach to government, but it was more that the monetary influences that are out there impact political processes and the fortunes of all the actors who participate in it. Sheridan was quite an individual. He was my first boss in state government, dynamic individual, a prolific writer, an incredibly prolific writer, and he challenged executive budget dominance, and I was really pleased to have been able to work with him in the very early years of that organization, the Legislative Budget Office, which is now part of the Service Commission, of course. Now, government budgets and business budgets, they're two things that are actually quite different in scope. Government budgets are expressions of public policy, and I would argue, others may differ, but that they're more important in many ways than business-type budgets, because they're not determined by the marketplace. These budgets are the culmination of political processes. They provide benchmarks to managers. They actually give pre-approval, if you will, of what managers and administrators can go out and do. You know, the late Aaron Wildofsky, who's one of the people that I first read in graduate school at Ohio State, described public budgeting as a series of goals with price tags attached. But I think public budgeting, and I know Sheridan would have agreed, is much more than that. It's much more than a roadmap. It's much more than a moral document. It is first and foremost a political document. It tells us what the political party in power is going to be doing over the next 2 years that they might be in office, or at the federal government, perhaps 1 year, or the city or local governments. Political considerations, though, are only one part of that equation. Other considerations weigh into it: programmatic considerations and policy considerations. So you really have that kind of a triumvirate of impacts that determine what goes into a budget process. I really like the way that former and legendary Ohio House Speaker described budgets as simply saying, in Ohio's context, the budget is everything. And the enactment of budget and public policy are, frankly, in Ohio, virtually indistinguishable. Now, there is significant legislation, obviously, that occurs outside the parameters of the budget. And we're talking, legislation on guns or choice and abortion issues. Those kind of things are outside necessarily the state budget process. But many public policy issues, some of which may only seemingly have a tangential impact, if at all, on state budget processes, are incorporated in the budget document, because it's often easier to have leadership agree on a package of things rather than on any one individual item, which may or may not be more controversial. So in our recent publication, we have added the term public policy to the title, so it's not just state budgeting in Ohio, but state budgeting and public policy, because again, they're so similar in policy. I want to recognize Tara Britton here from the Center for Community Solutions. Tara, can you stand up? Tara authored Tara and Lauren Anthony's authored each a chapter, which I really think broadened the scope in terms of analyzing the Kasich administration on a number of dimensions: social services, which you authored, Medicaid, which Lauren authored, and I authored one on education. We also had a committee, Gene Krebs, back there. Gene, you were instrumental in the work there, so I thank you as well, and anybody else who was on that committee who I may miss. But I was really happy we were able to address in depth the public policy issues and some of the important things that happened during the Kasich administration, because whatever you think of Governor Kasich, he had some contradictory things, but he was also a very consequential governor. What are the enduring budget fundamentals that we have? I would say there are several. One is, in Ohio, we do what services are required, and we don't usually go beyond that unless we absolutely have public pressure to do so. We also rely on local government to the extent possible for implementation. Very few people work for state government. Very few people, the money just kind of passes through in many ways, relatively speaking. I'm talking about relative to other states. And of course, recently, not only is the implementation often put off to the locals, but also paying for those services, as we know, has been an increasing burden that the locals must share. To the extent that things must be financed at the state level, we like to do things through fees and assessments wherever possible on the end user. And to the extent that they have to be done by taxes shared between individuals and businesses, although more recently that fulcrum has gone more towards the individual than the business. And something that's been true at least since Governor Jim Rose's first 2 terms in office is that whatever we do with tax policy, it has to not adversely impact economic development. And that was a major driver and I know in Governor Taft's 2005 tax package, which has impacted government for better and not so better perhaps since then. Now, in terms of Ohio's budget history, in terms of how we've evolved over the last number of years, we're one of the first states, actually, the first state to have an executive budget. In 1910, the governor was authorized by the legislature to develop and put forward an executive budget. And I really would contend that modern budgeting did not begin until roughly 60 years later, in 1971, when Governor Gilligan put forward and modernized our state by having the corporate franchise tax and also the individual income tax, but also at that time that brought a lot of partisan rancor. I think 6 months of interim budgets and great difficulties. But 1971 is a year that can't be overlooked. And since then, we had 30 years after that where we had ups and downs in state government, where the budget really wasn't used for strategic goals. It was used, in tough times, we had to raise taxes. And in good times, we would cut those taxes back. The level of services more or less stayed intact in many ways over the next 30 years. And then we finally got to the point with a term-limited legislature, with the Great Recession, with those individual income taxes cuts that I referred to in 2005, that you could no longer count on government to respond, at least in the legislature. But the governors, on the other hand, have this, what we call a box of responsibility, where they had to do some things to address the state's service needs. And so you came up with radical solutions in many ways that really don't fit a left-right kind of dimension, whether it be the securitization of the tobacco settlement portfolio by Governor Strickland, whether it be the selling of prisons or what was done on the turnpike bonds, or the cutting back of local government in any number of ways that happened early on in the Kasich administration. Those are radical solutions. So what is Ohio's future? What will Governor DeWines be looking at? In fact, I think he's wise to say that a number of his initiatives may not impact and see the impact, I mean, in his administration, but years out, because I think we have long-term some issues that we face in our great state. One is the fact that, it was only recently, in September of 2018, where we equaled the employment that we had in the year 2000. And because of having manufacturing employment being on such a downward curve, not only over the last 10 years, but over the last 40 or more years, and also an undereducated workforce, and also an aging population and workforce. Ohio ranks 36th in the percentage of its population, adults over 25 with a bachelor's degree. Perhaps we're no better with primary and secondary education, where over the last 8 years we've dropped from 5th in rankings by the Education Week to 22nd, although I'm sure you can find other rankings that might say different things. You always can. And in the long term, by 2030, we'll have a situation where 2/3 of Ohio counties will have populations that will be over 60 years of age or more. And what that means for Medicaid, which is already, has been until recently at least a fast-growing item in the budget, what that means in terms of the state, something I think that hasn't been told the story very much, the fact that we have shifted over time, particularly since 2005, from sales tax or consumption-based taxes to income tax, vice versa, from the income tax to the sales tax more. And as a consequence of that, I don't think you have a terrible impact now, but when we have an economic downturn, I think you'll really see some implications, because the sales tax has historically not grown at the same rate as the income tax. And then when you look at an aging population, they tend not to buy as many things. So those are some of the things that I see as real challenges for the DeWines administration, but indeed for the administrations that will follow. So at this point, I want to turn the podium over to Karen Kasler, of the Statehouse News Bureau, who will moderate this session between all of us. Thank you, Karen.
Well, while Terry is getting seated, I'll just throw a couple numbers at you, since we're talking about numbers here. $133 billion was the size of the last two-year budget. $2,691,554,191. That's the size of the budget stabilization or rainy day fund as of right now. There are 618,611 people on Medicaid expansion as of December, and there are 36 days until the budget has to be introduced, 143 days until it has to be signed, and most importantly, 49 days until Indians opening day. So let's talk a little bit. I want to throw the first question out to the panel here. This is a unique time in that we're coming out of an 8-year term, 2-year terms of Governor Kasich. We have Governor DeWines with a lot of initiatives that he's talked about, his priorities and creating high-paying jobs, fighting the opioid epidemic, keeping Medicaid expansion with some changes, prioritizing early childhood development and education. These are expensive things. This is a transition budget, so to speak. So what do you expect to see in this budget document that comes out? And go ahead and jump right in there.
I, for one, wouldn't want, or I would expect not to see too many aggressive initiatives right out of the gate, just because it is the first budget. So when you think about it, Governor DeWines was elected in November. He was sworn in January. He started naming all his cabinet directors and really getting his team in place. That doesn't give you a very much time between that point and March 15th to get your budget together and everything you want. So I think that, he's going to pick out, at least this is what I've seen other governors do, and I'm sure Terry and Gary have seen the same thing. They're marquee items that they want to include and really be aggressive on those. But honestly, this is, I think, a time where they're trying to figure out what is the state of, the economy, the revenues. What do we have to work with?
I think, I think that's definitely true. I think the governor was pretty clear in the campaign that children represents a key focus for him. And I think that most of what he is going to do is going to be focused in one way or another with helping children. I think that you're going to see a lot. He's made it pretty clear he wants more pre-K accessibility and good quality pre-K for children. I think you're going to see some work on foster care. That's a particular issue I know that's very important. It's always important, but it's gotten even more important in Ohio because of the opioid crisis. We have a lot of, unfortunately, parents that aren't able to discharge their responsibilities, and the children have been put into this system. I think you're going to see some work in there. So I think he's going to do a budget that focuses on that. And I would say that, you know, we're ahead right now. We have more revenues coming in. I think we were like $600 million or so ahead at the end of the last fiscal year, and we're close to $200 million ahead as of right now in the current fiscal year. I think you're going to see a lot of that money being spent. I should point out, too, we know there's going to be a new school funding formula, which is a whole set of issues in and of itself. We've had a history of, is it constitutional, is it not constitutional? There was litigation on that question. Some people, there's people with good intent on both sides of that. And I think you're going to see, but if there's a new funding formula, it's difficult to envision that that will be less funding than is currently in the system. And I'll also point out, we're starting at a hole in Ohio. The CHIP program, which is a children's health insurance program that the feds spend a lot of money on. The feds reauthorized it last year, reduced the federal matching rate, which means that the state portion of the CHIP program has to increase by approximately $200 million. And that's just to have the same level of service we have right now. That's not anything additional. So, you know, we've got all of that. So I think he's going to be conservative on a lot of budget areas and look for ways to stretch dollars. But I do think you're going to see some significant investments of some of the surplus that we have right now going into children's programs across a fairly wide swath of policy areas.
And I honestly could not agree more. And I think it's very telling that the first cabinet appointee that Governor DeWines made was with Leanne Cornyn, the Director of Children's Initiatives. And I think we should also add evidence-based home visiting to that list. So,
that's right.
absolutely.
I don't have a crystal ball, obviously, as to what Governor DeWines might put forward on March 15th. And Tracy knows from where she speaks as a former OBM senior analyst in terms of a new administration working through some of those difficulties. But I do think it would be incumbent upon Governor DeWines to try to put forward most of the priorities that he intends for the first 4 years, or maybe his whole term, as soon as possible. I have found that one of the very few areas where I disagreed with the original author of Follow the Money, Dick Sheridan, was that Dick often thought the second budget of an administration was the most important, because that is the budget that sets the stage for re-election, and most people only care about that kind of dimension, of course. That's understandable. But I really think that most public policy issues, as I've looked at administration after administration that get done successfully, are done right off the bat, and that fulcrum of executive dominance versus legislative dominance tends to go down. I mean, you know, things that happened in terms of overriding Governor Kasich's vetoes in 2008, 17, and 18 would have never happened in the first budget, is one example of that. So, you know, from a personal note, when I worked at the Ohio Association of Community Colleges, I think I got more done in Governor Taft's first budget than any other, and I probably worked less hard on that because I was able to successfully, you know, for whatever reason, get some of those initiatives into the budget, and they just kind of sailed. So, you know, little work, but it worked. It paid off well, and I think so. I really think that executive versus legislative powers are really often a function, not exclusively, but often a function of where you are in the term of office.
Honeymoon period.
So don't
they call
wait,
it.
is what you're saying. What was that?
Honeymoon period.
The honeymoon period. New governors, especially when they're of the same party as the General Assembly, they kind of get a little bit of a break, I think, and I think you saw that with Governor Kasich, and I think that you will see some of that likely with Governor DeWines, too, as well, because typically they want to kind of feel each other out. I think the governor's feeling the legislature out, the legislature's feeling the governor out. Nobody wants to step on anybody's toes right off of the bat, and I think so from the political dynamics, I think it also reinforces a little bit of what, quite a bit of what Terry was just saying.
I might point out even Governor Strickland, who had a different kind of a makeup. I think he had split houses for one of the first years. I think he only had one negative vote on his his first budget. And perhaps it was too much kumbaya at that time, because that might mean that, not a whole lot was changed or evolved as maybe he could have grabbed for in terms of the executive. And he came from a congressional background, so maybe that kind of shared focus was there. But I really am a strong believer you got to go for the gusto right off the bat.
Well, and lawmakers have said that they anticipate a better relationship potentially with Governor DeWines than they had at the end with Governor Kasich, and that speaks to some of the vetoes that you talked about there. But still, when you talk about all these things that he wants to do, it seems impossible to be able to do all of these things. I mean, one thing that DeWines has told me that he wants to do is spend more money on children's services. Ohio is 50th out of 50 states in terms of what the state puts in. So he wants to boost that. But then that begs or raises the question of, where does the money come from? You have certain things that are already Medicaid, prisons, education. There are certain areas that are pretty much established. Where do you get the money to boost in certain areas?
You have to make real reforms, and this is why the budget is everything. The budget is everything because the money dictates an awful lot, but then the policies that influence where that money gets spent. So I think you hit it on the nail on the head, Karen. You're going to be looking at Medicaid. There's going to be some changes, I think, to Medicaid. I think that goes without saying. It's a very big budget item. If you look at all the funds, it's almost 50% of the state budget is literally Medicaid when you combine state and federal funds together, and it's an increasing share of state funds. Two, we have a lot of people in prison in the Department of Rehabilitation and Corrections. There already has been significant policy adjustments. I envision there being more policy adjustments made to try to maneuver some folks out of the prison system and save the state money, some money there, not just to save money. There's other policy implications there too, but I think you're going to see some significant movement there. So you're going to have to shift some of those existing resources around quite a bit to get things right. And actually, even in education funding, you could do 2 or 3 shows on education funding, and hardly anybody would really understand every nuance of that. It's one of the most Byzantine things you can possibly imagine when you look at how the state and local governments interact and work together on this. But we don't really even have a funding formula right now in Ohio. We have caps and guarantees where some districts that have declining enrollments are getting the same amount of money they got years ago, and you have rapidly increasing enrollments in other districts that aren't getting the money from the state that they're supposed to get according to the funding formula. And that doesn't even include some of the issues regarding how do you fund charter schools adequately, how do you fund and do we have the right mix with some of the scholarship or voucher programs that are in the school choice movement. So I think you're going to have to see a lot of moving around in that funding formula and money that's already in the system, and finding other ways to prioritize where that money goes, even within the same system, but shifting it around so that you can reach the objectives that the governor has put forward. Because it's not always about new money, although sometimes it is, there's no doubt, but it's also about how do you prioritize the existing resources we already have.
Yeah, and I would also just add that currently we have several legislators that have been chairing an education funding work group for the past year, and their final report isn't out yet. So I'd be very curious, and I would want to see what they've included in that report. They've assembled a group of experts and folks from around the states that are truly, have deep expertise in school funding and in education tax policy. So I think that they probably have a lot to add to that conversation. But then on the other end, part of the budget process is also going back to the agencies and finding out, what programs are working. What programs are getting the best outcomes for Ohioans. And, especially, from my perspective, especially children and families. Just one example of where I think that, there's significant improvements that can be made to improve those outcomes around, things like youth prison. So currently we're spending around $100 million to incarcerate 500 youth. And our outcomes aren't great. There are better evidence-based programs that have better outcomes for those kids in terms of making sure they don't have high levels of recidivism, returning back to the juvenile justice system, that I think that could be implemented, freeing up a lot more money for, other programs like children's services. Probably not education, that's just giant, but we'll see what happens.
I don't see a whole lot of appetite for general, revenue increases, and I don't know if the budget stabilization fund, the rainy day fund, will be tapped or not, but I kind of not so sure that it'll be tapped either. And it's going to be very difficult to come up, particularly with primary and secondary education's needs. I think maybe one of the things, and he's a really solid legislator, Bob Cupp, has come up with is, a three-prong approach to early childhood education, wraparound services, positive behavioral intervention, and, I could see addressing some of those issues, but doing the formula, the wholesale change, I think we could move, as Greg indicated, some monies around, but the formula we have, I think it's really, regrettably, one of Governor Kasich's less noteworthy public policy areas, because we have literally 80% of our school districts or more, a little bit more than that are either on these artificial guarantees or caps. And if you remove the caps, the wealthier districts benefit. So there's something fundamentally odd about that. And perhaps the most dysfunctional thing about the system is that the base funding for it is not based on anything at all. And Bob Cupp has recognized that as well. It's just a number out there, $6,020, I believe, this year per student.
Well, it was once, based on something.
Well, yeah, Governor Strickland had the evidence-based formula, and I think that is clearly a way to go, and I think some legislators in both parties think that. But when you propose it, of course, at the time of the Great Recession, when you know there's not going to be any funds available, it's not terribly meaningful to the school districts, other than pointing a direction in which we should turn in the long run. But Governor Strickland even then realized it was something that would take five biennia or so to achieve, and it's something you don't change in a single biennium.
And lawmakers haven't had years to think about this problem or anything since
no.
1997.
No, this is a 50-year issue, 50-year issue. And honestly, the whole gain cap guarantee issue, that has its roots back in Voinovich. I think that was when we first started seeing the guarantees. And honestly, until there's, significant monies being invested in education at the state level, it's, any changes are really just philosophical.
Well, one of the things that's interesting, though, and I the education is such a hot topic, and it always is, and it always will be. But I can't stress to you how complicated this is, and the issue of Ohio and local control and what local boards want to have is part of what drives some of this as well. We talk about the state, and so the state spends less basically in wealthier districts because wealthier districts have more taxing capacity to raise money at the local level, and sometimes they have more will to raise the taxes at the local level. So you have the combination of ability and willpower. But if you wanted the state, Governor Voinovich offered, was it a penny sales tax increase back in the 90s when the Roth case, which was a constitutional case, it was voted down. So we, the people of Ohio, said, no, we don't want to spend more on sales tax to fund education. He put it out there. The people said no. How do we, so, we do need to be a little careful about that and understand that, it's not, yes, it's that complicated interplay, and how do we manage the local control, the local dollars into the system, because it's the entirety of the system we have to look at, not only the state portion, even though the state portion is clearly integrally important to it.
The idea of taxes, I want to seize on that for a minute here. When you start talking about all the things that you want to do and the money that is available and also the possibility, there are no economic signs of a recession right now, but history suggests that one could be on the way. Kasich, when he was doing budgets, had tried to increase some taxes in order to cut others. For instance, the cigarette tax, the severance or fracking tax, the sales tax. Do you see that as a possibility from Mike DeWines, especially with a legislature that seems to be very interested in cutting more taxes?
I would say that I don't see anything nearly as big coming from Governor DeWines as what we saw with Governor Kasich. Kasich ran on potentially even eliminating the income tax, and he tried to pay that down with, as you mentioned, a number of the other taxes. Now, the Buckeye Institute has generally been supportive of further modifications to the sales tax. There's a lot of economic literature about why you want consumption like a sales tax. It is more positive for economic growth to do less taxes on income. Again, I can give you, if anybody's interested, I can give you all kinds of literature on why that's the case. I think it's demonstrably provable that less taxes on income means more economic growth over time. That was the impetus behind some of the tax policies that Terry was mentioning earlier, that Governor Taft did in the mid-2000s, and when we did income tax reductions. I'll point out Ohio has had the problem with Ohio is that Ohio has been behind the curve for over 50 years. I mean, we have to understand that the budget is in the context of a state that goes into recessions before other states, stays in recessions longer than other states. We lost more private jobs in the first decade of the 21st century than any private sector jobs in any state in the country except Michigan. That obviously has tax implications and everything else. So what do we need to do? So tax policy is about job growth too, and that's the whole point. So I don't think we're going to see a ton of changes right now because I don't think the budget room is there to do that. But we want to be very careful about there may be some marginal things that we can do to shift around a little bit. I don't see that happening right now. Would that be good for Ohio? Probably, but we'll have to have that conversation probably several budgets later. I just don't see taxes being changed a ton. Again, maybe on the margin, but I just don't know how you're going to do that with some of the spending that we hear might be coming online.
I don't either, and Greg referenced Ohio being behind the curve. He wouldn't agree with this, I think, but that I've seen some recent polls at the national level, and frankly, I've been shocked at people's willingness to support, and public opinion polls can be, very nebulous, and you find out who the winners and losers are as things go down the line. But some of the proposals by, Senator Warren of 2% on the ultra rich or 3% on the super rich, and Congresswoman Ocasio's proposals as well, and they're getting 60-70% approval rates, which I'm somewhat skeptical of, but. It shows that I don't think we're going to have a further major drive towards reducing the income tax like Governor Kasich seemed really bent on it to do so, and he reduced it from 7.9 or something on the upper brackets down to 4.9.
Well, we used to have over 9% at one point.
Yeah.
Before 2005 and the Taft tax cuts, Ohio had a 9% top marginal rate. And by the way, that wasn't the limit, because one thing we haven't talked about is Ohio's incredibly bad local tax structure. That's probably worth a whole conversation of itself. But you can pay another 2.5% at the municipal tax level. Most states don't do a municipal tax, by the way. We are one of very few states that even has a tax at the city level. So you piggyback that on top of it. And if you're unlucky enough to live in a school district where a school district has income taxes, which, by the way, no other state that I'm aware of in the country, I don't think, has a local school district-based income tax possibility. Not all districts do it, only about a third of them do. But you can have over double digits in just state and local taxes. Forget about the federal taxes. That's just state and local taxes. So Ohio has historically had a bad tax. I mean, that's what the whole idea for why Kasich did what he did is these cumulative taxes are problematic and bad for long-term economic growth.
I think also one of the things that we need to recognize too, though, is when we're talking about taxes, just the large number of people, of families in this state who are making, are working low-income jobs. And, one of the things that we should consider is this might be time for an earned income tax credit, especially at a time when we have, 7 of the 10 fastest growing jobs in the state of Ohio can't sustain a family. So we need to be rewarding work. We need to be able to help those families, especially with children, be able to afford their child care, be able to afford, just the basic necessities that they need. And, research has shown that EITC is one of the, most successful anti-poverty programs. I think it's time for Ohio to really start taking a look at that.
We are going to move to audience
Expand
questions
again.
in just a few minutes, so please, if you have a question, step up over to the microphone over there. Just don't be shy. Let me ask one final question to set us all up for this. We talked a little bit about Medicaid expansion and this kind of struggle between the executive branch and the legislative branch, and there were signs there toward the end of Kasich's administration that legislators were very unhappy with the way that they felt that their power had been taken away a little bit, and they wanted to pull back, especially when it came to Medicaid. Now we have a situation where Mike DeWines wants to continue Medicaid expansion, but with certain things like work requirements and wellness incentives. So do you expect more restrictions on Medicaid? Could that be a way to free up money for other things? And how would that affect those people who are in that population?
I would say that there's, and by the way, Governor Kasich, I should say, circumvented the legislature on the Medicaid expansion when he went to the controlling board. We shouldn't forget that. That's one of the reasons the legislature wasn't very happy with Governor Kasich, and was one of the reasons that led to some of their overrides of his vetoes in subsequent budgets. However, yeah, I think somewhat yes. I will say that some of the things with work requirements and other waivers where the state can go to the feds to get more flexibility in how Medicaid operates is not just, I mean, yes, it might have a positive budget impact, but I'd say that there's a broader issue here, which is we want to make sure that we're getting people up and off of the Medicaid system and into gainful employment and employment where incomes can rise. So a lot of people that are on Medicaid do work today, but because of income situations, and you have big impacts on people when they make more money, then they lose all their benefits, and so then it's rational for them to say, well, maybe I don't want to do that because I can't afford that. We need to find a better smooth path, a glide path to people, because really, what we want is people to not be getting state paid for insurance and taxpayer funded insurance, which is what Medicaid is. It's government health care, even no matter how you slice the cake on that. We want them to be able to get good jobs, good paying jobs that will allow them to get health care in the private good health care in the private marketplace. And so I think some of these things like work requirements, like other sorts of waivers, are going to be designed to do that. To the extent that they have a salutary budgetary impact, that is good, but that is not really the primary reason you want to do these kind of policies. There's a moral case to be made for them too.
There are also some issues with some of those implementations, especially in Arkansas. So, but I wanted to give you both a chance to answer before we went to questions. Anything you want to say?
Yes, just the position of Children's Defense Fund of Ohio, we would not want to see work requirements in the state of Ohio. We believe that all people that qualify should be able to access health care. And also, when you think about it, when adults have access to health care and are using it, they're more likely to get health care for their children and for their children to use it. And I think that it's one of those conversations, yes, you're right, it's moral, because I think we need to consider beyond, the bottom line of how many pennies we can save, but also what are the health impacts and the disparate health impacts, that some of these policy decisions have on real people in our communities, our neighbors. So we need to also make sure that that's in the mix. And I'm happy to say when I was at OBM, that was always part of the conversation. It wasn't about how much money we can save on the margins, but what is the impact to Ohioans? What is the impact to Ohioans in southeastern Ohio, in our inner cities, in our rural areas and suburbans? I mean, that was part of the calculus here that we have to remember.
I certainly agree with Tracy, but I do foresee with the governor's pronouncements so far on these kind of issues, and also the legislature especially, and with the willingness of the federal government, certainly you're going to probably see more restrictions on work requirements, et cetera, in the future.
Let's find out what our audience members want to talk about. It is CMC's tradition, of course, to take audience questions. Please state your name and ask your question. Not editorial comment. Question ends in a question mark. So go right ahead.
My name is Karen Twynham, and I am an advocate for people with severe and persistent mental illness. We felt more comfortable in the Kasich administration because Governor Kasich had a personal commitment to people with mental illness. What is the impact that you expect in the budget for people who do have mental illness?
One of the things that I know that we would like to see from the children's perspective is for there to be more targeted support for children's mental health, and especially better coordination for children interacting with, different systems. We call them multi-system youth, and a lot of times they're dealing with mental health issues. They might be dealing with, several other issues, be it with their families or others, but, I know from the children's perspective, that's one of the things that we'd greatly like to see, especially at the younger years and in the school-based settings.
And I think the governor has set up a council that will deal with both mental health as well as drug addiction. So I think he's made a statement that he's committed to continuing some of that.
Gene Krebs, would you comment on the statutory appropriation limitation?
Wow, a fascinating piece that goes all the way back to 2006 and the campaign of 2006, the gubernatorial race. The SAL, they call it. I looked at the SAL. I don't see the SAL as being, I don't really, it's an appropriation limitation, and what it basically does is it says that you can't have state general revenue funds grow more. There's a cap basically on what you can spend as an increase. It's like population and inflation, I think. It's a combination, kind of an amalgamation number. And so once you do that, so the state's not supposed to spend more than that in, again, general revenue funds. I don't really think the SAL is that meaningful for the following reason. First of all, it was recalibrated in the Kasich administration. It came out of the Great Recession, and then but there was a time period where you could tweak it and re-baseline the general revenue funds. And Ted Strickland took a whole bunch of stuff off of general revenue funds during the Great Recession, and the governor, Kasich, pulled a whole bunch of stuff back on and then used that to re-baseline the general revenue fund. So he increased what the SAL could be earlier on in his administration and set a higher cap, basically, by doing that. And the other reason is, if you want to take something off of general revenue funds and make it user fee based or other special dedicated purpose funding, for example, $3 billion of Medicaid funding no longer comes out of general revenue funds. So if you look at the GRF budget for Medicaid, you'd say, oh my God, we spent $3 billion less on Medicaid. That's really good. Well, no, that's not true. You're still spending more on Medicaid. It's because there's a federal pass-through that now is a dedicated purpose line item as opposed to a general revenue fund line item. So all of that is to say you're going to pull money off out of it and put it into these other areas. So no, I think for all those reasons, it's not going to be that overly meaningful.
As Greg indicates, there's a myriad of ways to circumvent it, and also it has no real force. I mean, it's something that the legislature could remove of its own volition. It has no constitutional purpose. Now, it's a political issue. It could be at some point in the future, but I don't see spending going that high that it would become an impact at any time soon anyway, and if it does, they'll find some way to avoid it.
Go ahead.
I'm Stacy Rostauskas with Ohio State University. Before I ask my question, I just want to compliment that you have 4 Ohio State alums on the panel today leading this discussion, so we're very proud. We'll take it afterwards, yeah. My question, though, and a little bit piggybacking off of the previous conversation, there's a lot of dynamic going on at the federal level with respect to the budget. I'm curious what you think there might be, how that will impact the state, and both dynamic and just specific issues. We've covered Medicaid or talked about Medicaid, but over the last 4 to 6 years, we've seen, again, changes at the federal level having impacts on the state budget. So what do you expect in the DeWine administration?
I think the most immediate thing that I'm concerned about is just, that's the SNAP benefits. They were released in, mid to late January for February, and so you have families that are trying to make their February SNAP benefits last 6 weeks rather than 4. And with a potential for another shutdown in the next week and a half, I mean, that could have some serious immediate, issues, especially for a large swath of our population, children and families here. So that's something that I think many of us in the room that are, advocates for children are keeping an eye on. But the long-term issues, I mean, it seems like we're getting to the system or the cycle of instability, with these budget impasses.
We had, I'll say one thing where it was a direct one, which I mentioned, I think, earlier, was the CHIP program, and the fact that the change in the matching rate means the state has to put in a great deal more money this year just to keep the baseline. So that's one significant impact right there, although I think that will be resolved. The state, they're going to do that. I'd say, too, the tax issues with the tax bill, there's the deductibility or the cap on the deductibility for state and local taxes. And as I mentioned earlier, we have relatively high state or local taxes. So so that's going to could have some impact here in Ohio in terms of some of the revenue that goes into the feds that way, and it could have an impact where it makes it harder for people to raise taxes at the local level because they're no longer able to deduct it on their federal tax returns. So I think that will be something that we're going to see over time have an impact.
Go ahead.
Hi, good afternoon. William Tarter Jr. from the Center for Community Solutions, two-time Ohio University graduate, so at least we're in the room. So one of the things that I wanted to ask this panel, I just came from the Governor's Advisory Committee on Transportation Infrastructure. There was a lot of conversation over the past 2 days about the future of transportation, in particular the possible increase of the gas tax. So my question to this panel is, could you talk about our current state of transportation and its needs, and in particular the impact of transportation to an older state that will be requiring more public transportation in the future?
I mentioned that we had turned to some radical solutions in my initial comments, and one of those was the turnpike revenues being used to essentially prop up the gas tax. Well, Governor Kasich has left Governor DeWines with a real problem now in terms of what to do, particularly when the appetite for tax increases is not great. I do think there'd probably be more support for a transportation gas tax increase than virtually any other, but I think Speaker Householder pointed out it's something, if they consider, it'd be something that maybe you should only have you have a short-term and a long-term approach, because with more fuel-efficient vehicles, indeed with vehicles that don't even use gasoline, you're going to have a heck of a problem by 2030, even if you raise the gas tax by a quarter or more. And even, you have a, what is it, 400 million or more you'd need to increase it right now just to bring us to where we were. So it's a real dilemma. It's something that the governor better tackle right away and in his approach. And I think the transportation budget usually goes through the legislature during this first quarter. So it might be the first controversial issue that he'll have to deal with as governor, really.
In fact, the transportation budget has to be signed by March 30th, and March 31st, rather. And one thing that ODOT Director Jack Marchbanks also said is not only the major construction for big new projects, but also the maintenance for regular projects is starting to be threatened by this. And he said it wasn't just the Kasich administration, it goes back to at least 3 different administrations that have kind of allowed that debt to pile up. So go ahead, Greg.
Well, I think you're, the gas tax is an interesting thing because it's more of a user fee than most other taxes, because in theory it used to be the more you drive, the more gas you buy, so it's kind of a user fee. That's not as true now for some of the reasons that were mentioned. You've got electric vehicles that don't necessarily pay any. So we're going to have to figure out how we get them to pay their fair share, quite frankly, because, that's not really happening right now. I think there's going to be a real conversation about the transition to a different form of taxation because of all the changes in technology. And I think that eventually we're going to get to the point where we're going to have what they call a vehicle mile travel tax. Now, what that looks like, there's a whole myriad of ways that you could do it. Some are kind of big brother and spooky, like putting a GPS in your car. A lot of people will feel very uncomfortable, and I think rightfully so about that. But there's other ways that you can do it without that. You're not going to see that in this transportation budget all in, but it wouldn't surprise me if you see some pilot programs to start trying to have a conversation about that, because whatever you do with the gas tax, whether you hike it or not, it is a temporary solution to a long-term systemic challenge for how we fund that infrastructure.
One more question.
My name's Jack Etheridge, and first of all, I thank you for a very broad-ranging discussion. Here's my question. I know that it's no secret that over the last year or two, we've seen dramatic economic growth in the country, and my question is, how do you see that trending in Ohio, and what impact do you think that will have on the budget as it relates to the amount to spend and the savings that the state will see due to increased employment and GDP growth?
That's a really interesting question, but one of the things I think that goes alongside that is how our state is preparing for the 2020 census. Because right now we don't have the statewide committee named, we don't have an appropriations, and as you know or might know, the census is important not only to our federal allocations coming to the state, but also to business, chambers of commerce. Many businesses use this to cite, where they're going to have their new operations. And without a complete or accurate count in Ohio, we're really going to be behind the 8 ball on a lot of things. Also, just general representation. We're on line to lose 1 or 2 congressional seats as a result of it. So unfortunately in Ohio, the census comes right, the year after or a year and a half after our gubernatorial election. So we're kind of late to the game every time preparing for it. So I just implore everyone in this room, get involved in your complete count committees and participate in the census, and encourage your local officials to stand up committees. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, I think Ohio is doing well by Ohio standards, but I always like to say that's not necessarily the standards we should be aspiring to. Ohio has, again, never once, in over 50 years, if you look at a 4-year term of a governor, not once in over 50 years has a governor had job growth at the national average, much less above the national average. So even though we're doing well by Ohio standards, we're still below the national average. It fluctuates maybe on a year-by-year basis, but over a 4-year period, rolling basis, that's the case. So that is, Ohio is going to not be as good as the nation as of right now, and that's going to have an impact. And I have some concerns that we may have a structurally unsound budget. And by that I mean when the storm clouds come, and it's more than just the fog outside, we are going to have some problems in Ohio. It may not be as bad as the Great Recession was, but we still are. I don't think we've recovered the private sector job peak that we had as far back as 2000 when the tech bubble burst. We just recovered. So we just recovered. So it took over 18 years to recover the jobs, the net jobs that we had back in March of, I think it was like March of 2000. So that's something that we have to be very careful about. I would urge that we don't be tapping into the budget stabilization fund, and that we are very careful with what we do with any surplus revenue we have today.
Yeah, and along with those jobs created, I'd also be cautious just about the quality of the jobs in terms of how much income or the wage growth associated with them. They're not the jobs that we had 20 years ago.
Real quickly, even though we've made some progress in Ohio during the Kasich administration on jobs relative to the past, we'd still have, if we were at national averages during the last 8 years, we'd have had 152,000 more jobs in Ohio. And also, if you look at wages, we're at 49,000 average wage now versus the national average of 55,000. It's a $6,000 gap. If you look back to 1970, I don't know offhand what it would have been, but Ohio had been, for years and years, always a leader in wages in the top half.
Terry gets the first word and the last word.
There you
Thank
go.
you. Carol.
I hope you found today's forum enlightening. For more enlightenment, consider purchasing the 4th edition of Follow the Money, available next to our podium. And hopefully you'll feel more optimistic after you get into it even further. Let's thank our partners, the Center for Community Solutions and the Buckeye Institute. And our speakers, Greg Lawson, Tracy Nájera, Terry Thomas, and Karen Kasler. Thank you. And thank you all for coming. I hope to see you next week for Afrocentric Education. Thank you.